Hello.
I'm Naomi Habert. I'm a student that lives in the sociology department. And I'm introducing Professor Pontell today, but before I read his bio, I just want to give a big shout out to Professor Pontell because last semester before he came in, when Professor Rick Curtis was interim chair, we were waiting and waiting for Professor Pontell to get here, and I remember one morning I was living in the conference room doing my homework, and I see a lost man in the corridor, and I'm like, excuse me, do you need any help? He goes, yeah, I'm the new chair. And so we sat down from there because no one was around at the time. And since then, Professor Pontell not only has shared information about all the events that I put on very enthusiastically, but in DC when we were at ASC, he came out, it was really early in the morning, 8 o'clock or something, and came to my conference presentation and asked questions, and very, very supportive, and for that I am very grateful. So, okay, so let me tell you a little bit about him. So, Henry Pontell is Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Sociology. Before joining the faculty of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in January 2015, he was a professor at the University of California, Irvine, where he is now a professor emeritus of Criminology, Law, and Society in the School of Social Ecology and of Sociology in the School of Social Sciences. At UCI, he served as chair of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society, director of graduate studies in social ecology, associate dean of graduate studies for the campus, and faculty assistant to the vice chancellor for research. He's done a shitload. He has also held visiting appointments at the Australian National University, the University of Virginia, the University of Melbourne, the University of Macau, Macau University of Science and Technology, the University of Hong Kong, and Waseda University in Tokyo, Japan. He conceived and led the development of the Master of Advanced Study program in Criminology, Law, and Society, which in 2003 became the first online degree program at the University of California. The program was rated #1 in the nation by the U.S. News and World Report in its first ranking of online criminal justice graduate programs in January 2015, shortly after he retired as its director in 2016. Okay, so I want to give a big, one more shout out, round of applause for Professor Pontell.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Naomi, for that really lovely introduction, and really the stuff you do here is unbelievable. We really appreciate your efforts as well as a student. It's all about the students here. So first I want to thank everybody for coming, and just before the holidays, and so I apologize. I'm walking with a cane. I'm a little unsteady, but I'm good. I've been to enough doctors, and everybody says, we'll find it, whatever the hell is bugging you, but everything else is fine. The good news is nothing's wrong. The bad news is nothing's wrong. U.S. healthcare system, we've been studying that in white collar crime. John Hipp was supposed to be here today, and a good colleague of mine in California, one of the top community and crime people in the country. Nice guy, great guy, you'd love him, but family illness, and he'll postpone until the fall. So we'll have him come back. So in the meantime, said, you know what? I've come here, I've never done a research presentation to a non-class, so this would be an opportunity to do one. So I pulled together some stuff, and hopefully this will be entertaining and, again, interesting in terms of those of you who are just interested in it. Excuse my voice. Inequality, social justice, white-collar crime, and the role of what white-collar crime is and how it played into what we now saw within the last decade as the biggest crisis in world history. Which affects all of the things we study and all the things we look at in terms of inequality, in terms of social justice, in terms of economic justice, in terms of criminal justice. You name anything, it's all about lack of capacity, inequality, growing inequality. Hopefully some of this stuff will help you understand this, at least from a sociologist, criminologist point of view, rather than the typical, the economists that they hire in Washington. Anyone see Big Short movie? Okay, so some of you seen, I just watched it last night, not bad. Any of you seen Inside Job? Not bad. But my opinion, my my opinion, is simply that Inside Job gives you a much straighter picture. Big Short is very entertaining, terrific acting, and yeah, it did happen, and people did call it that way. It's a little hard to understand. If you listen to Matt Damon, who narrates Inside Job, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary, that's all you need to watch and to see what happened if you're still wondering after this presentation. Inside Job will answer your questions. So without further ado, and again, given that we're ready for a break, aren't we? Thank you. Thank you for coming. It's the day before the break. This is a great turnout. I appreciate you coming. So this guy, you probably know, you know who this is. Bernie Madoff, and the reason I have his picture up here.
Raise the microphone, please.
Okay, sure. The reason, do you have a walking mic somewhere?
Behind you.
Behind me. If I turn around fast, I'll
Oh,
fall
sorry.
down, so. I'll do that for you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so Bernie Madoff, why do I have his picture up here? Well, he was the quote-unquote poster boy, if you will, for the 2008 debacle. And biggest Ponzi scheme in history, there's Bernie, right? You know who he is. He's going to stay in prison for the rest of his life. I don't know how old, he's 70s by now. He's going to be at 25, he'll die in prison. His son already committed suicide, tragic story. Classic Ponzi, $65 billion Ponzi scheme. I could tell you stories, we don't have time, I won't tell you the stories. I have lots of stories about Bernie. But the bottom line is that Bernie was the poster boy, and he didn't cause the crisis. He was the poster boy of the crisis. He was convicted. Warren Buffett, who some of you may know, the most successful capitalist in history, right? One of the wealthiest people in the world, investor, Warren Buffett, said Bernie Madoff was kind of the garbage that washed up on the beach once the tide went out. And that's what's happened. That's exactly right. He didn't cause this crisis. It was the crisis that led us to Bernie, because as the crisis happened, right, people called Bernie and said, sell our investments. He didn't have their investments. Sell our investments. He didn't have their investments. Thus, he was found out to be the fraud that he was. He was found out by the crisis. But when you tell your grandchildren about the crisis, if they ever saw your children, if they say, what about that, well, Mom, Dad, what about that 2008 crisis? Don't say, oh, that was Bernie Madoff. It wasn't. He was found out by the crisis. He did not cause the crisis. As one, Matt Tiabi, who's written a number of books, Village Voice writer, I think it was him or somebody else, or the other guy, I can't remember his name, said if you look at it like food, an appetizer being the crisis, he was like literally a bite. He wasn't the crisis. Yeah, $65 billion, a lot of money. It's a big Ponzi scheme. He's paying for it, but he didn't cause the crisis. He was found out by the crisis. Next picture. So here's the Madoff scheme, this giant thing. He's evil, he's got horns, blah, blah, blah. And the pocket watchdog. And this is about what the SEC was doing and not doing during the time of the crisis. The pocket watchdog that, you know, you see Bernie Madoff's scheme is big, SEC is small, true, very true. The SEC, by the way, is our regulatory agency, which is involved in regulating all business in the United States. There is no way that that agency has the capacity and the number of investigators to actually police it properly. So you see this guy in here, his name is Chris, and it's very tiny, so I'm pointing here, Chris Cox. Long story short, Chris Cox was my congressman from conservative Southern California, who became head of the SEC during the Bush administration, right while the crisis was going on. So what he did, in short, and there's been testimony, and I've been at hearings and know people and talk to people, that he virtually gutted the investigative policing part of the SEC during his tenure. But let me just finish that.
I'm wondering if it's related to Ed Cox, the son-in-law.
I'm not sure, but the Ed Cox, which one?
Son-in-law of President Nixon.
Yeah, the one that married, yeah, I'm not sure. But when he became president of the SEC, those of us who were studying this were so enraged that I said, no, it's time to write for the newspapers. And then we find out that he was actually a co-sponsor of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act from 2002. This is a totally pro-business guy, total conservative, and we're going, wait a minute. He was one of like a handful of senators I'm sorry, a handful of congresspersons who signed on to one of the toughest pieces of legislation ever in the United States against corporations. This is from the Enron et al. Meltdown, which we just looked at classmates who were here. So he signed, and you'll see that Sarbanes-Oxley came out of that basically saying, in a nutshell, that strict liability for CEOs. Basically, even if you come before us and say, I didn't know what was going on in my corporation, that they were filing false papers, you're going to prison. The toughest piece of, so of course, corporations and all kinds of, what are they called, not consumer, boards of, chambers of commerce, national, state, city, they all fight this. They're all fighting the hell out of it. They've watered it down. They tried to destroy it. That was a Sarbanes-Oxley, yeah. Okay. So here you see the Madoff scheme going on while the SEC is basically in his pocket. And the other part of this story, which is really horrible, there was an accountant who turned in Bernie Madoff, I think 2 or 3 times to the SEC, wrote a book, and they just didn't even bother to go. This guy is showing things that just, it's insane, it's not possible. He had all the data, and they said, well, you have all the data, but there are still these unanswered questions. He showed them all the red flags, and the SEC didn't do anything. They could have stopped Madoff before he got this big. Mark Goff, or I can't remember his name right now. Okay. Last cartoon, I had a bunch of them, but only time to show you these. So this is Madoff in prison. This is the joke. So he's sitting there with cartons of cigarettes. Madoff, the cons are saying, I'm serious, I gave him 3 butts, and a month later, I got a whole carton back. The man's a genius. That's Ponzi scheme. That's all it is. All right? So what does all this have to do with sociology, law, criminology, or white-collar crime? I've studied white-collar crime for a long time, as you know. And what I'm going to try to do in a nutshell, because we don't have that much time, and I know some of you will have questions, so we'll have plenty of time for questions, is to show you what sociology and what criminology has to say about these debacles, and how you can use sociology and criminology to look at these things, other than what Sumners and economic advisors or economists or corporate governance theorists have to say about it. It's all related. I mean, part of this story is you can't understand this totally by sociology or criminology. You have to at least bring in critique the economics work in these other areas. But sociology and criminology has a pretty good tradition of looking at these things. Unfortunately, we don't have a chief criminologist at the SEC, which is insane. We have a chief economist, we got the legal, we got everybody else. No criminal, nothing. So a fast story on that, which I think you'll enjoy, because it does involve John Jay. A number of years ago when I was vice president of ASC, I asked Bill Black, who some of you will find out who he is real soon. He's working for Bernie Sanders right now. Does a lot of this stuff. It's in the presentation. There's also Michael Moore's movie, Capitalism, A Love Story. I say, yeah, you're a grad student. You want to write a lead, I was editor of the newsletter that goes out nationally. I said, you want to write a lead piece on something related to this? He says, yeah, so he writes this piece. The title of the piece, Why the SEC Does Not Have a Chief Criminologist. I get a note, and it's hanging in my office on personal stationery from Donald McNamara, from John Jay, to me personally, saying, Dr. Pontell, great, that was one of the best articles ever. It was a lead article. You have lead articles to the newsletter, it's an interesting story. He says, that was one of the best articles ever in the criminologist that he'd seen in his life. And I have that hanging in my office. That's what that meant to me. Personally, I met him a few times, wonderful man. Actually helped me start my career with my first article. He was editor of criminology, and he published my first piece back in the 70s, John Jay folks. So, and if white-collar crime was involved in all this, which some people debate, why haven't there been any major prosecutions resulting from the current crisis? Now, as a historical note, the Enron crisis, the Enron et al., Anderson, people went to prison. Heads of those companies went to prison. The savings and loan crisis, over 1,000 savings and loan owners went to prison. Bill Black was one of the regulators then who developed the systems for regulators and criminal attorneys and all the agencies to get together so they could work in task force fashion. And they got through a bunch of cases. Took a few shots. Hey, 5 years, 10 years, 5 years, we don't have to prove the whole fraud. You did this, boom, next. They had all the mechanisms. in this crisis, the biggest ever, and I think I estimated in one article, somewhere between 30 to 40 times the size, the destruction worldwide of the savings and loan crisis, which in the 1980s, which was at that time the biggest crisis ever, cost over probably 160, 140, whatever they resolved it at, but initially about 500 billion. The current crisis, 30 to 40 times bigger, and not one person, other than mice, going to prison. The mice go to prison, the lions roam free. That's the analogy. That's all you gotta know. So why haven't there been? So this is a major sociological, criminological question. Not many of us in the area study this, and it, you know, to some sociologists or criminologists said, oh, it's politics. So we had David Garland here a couple of weeks ago. Great sociologist, NYU guy, right? So I asked him the question about white-collar crime punishment, because he's talking about punishment, crime. Listen, what about white-collar criminals? Is that not crime? And his answer simply was, oh, well, you know, that'll be positive when it's, it's political. Well, the sociologists have to unpack, critical criminologists unpack what that means. So if everything's political, I mean, maybe it was a short answer. I'm sure we'd have a good discussion if there was time. But that's really the attitude. Well, that's political. It's not illegal. You know, it's the law. And we'll get into that right now. It is a major sociological, criminological study. Finally, what does all this have to say about social inequality, which has grown in the United States? That's a fact. There's sociology right there. Take stratification. Inequality is at an all-time high. More money is pushed to the top 1% and to the top 0.1% than ever before in history. And there are numbers out there that are insane, like the 0.1% owns 96% of the wealth, 1% owns 50%. How does that work? How is that ever going to work? How are you going to sustain a society with that kind of inequality? So you got economists, good economists at Berkeley and other places who document all this. What does it mean about social justice in terms of all the issues of social justice? Lots of things out there, and this has become a new area, literally it's become a new area within the field of social science, social justice. And what does it mean about criminal justice in America as well? These are major issues. Hopefully what I'm talking about today will touch on all these. Why is there such vast inequality? Why is it tough to make a living? Why is it tough to get a job? Why is it tough to live in New York? What's going on? And what does these crises mean for everyday people? And what do these things say about sociology and criminology? So this goes back to the movies I was talking about. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time explaining CDOs and credit default swaps and all the other stuff that they did. Bottom line is insane, totally insane. I can tell you in a nutshell, yeah, there was fraudulent origination of loans, subprime especially. I've written on inequality there, so they targeted the poor, racial minorities, et cetera, to sell these insane loans to that were never going to be paid back. They then took those loans, and any of you ever had a loan in your life? Any kind of loan? A car loan, house loan? Okay, so you have a loan with the bank, right? You go to the bank, okay, here's your loan. So what the banks are doing is, they're saying, all right, well, let's get this off our books. We just sold so-and-so a loan. They'd shoot it upstream, basically up to Wall Street. Wall Street would securitize those loans all to get thousands of loans together, sell them as a security to investors. It's off the bank. You know, where's your loan now? It's not at the bank. They sold it. Wall Street's got it, and they sold it, and they're selling it worldwide. So their bubble that resulted from that, total heated up situation. What happens when there's a bubble? Well, bubbles typically explode. They don't eventually just go softly down. If something grows really rapidly, blows up. Bubbles blow up. But, you know, the wisdom in Washington there is no bubble. There's no such thing as bubbles. So if you're into the magic of the market and a free market ideologue, you're basically going to say, no, the free market takes care of that stuff. We don't need rules and regulations because there's no. Greenspan said this, head of the National Reserve, president of the Reserve Bank. There's no such thing as bubbles. Ayn Rand, you know, Ayn Rand kind of guy. So, quick through this. Subprime loans. These were the horrible, toxic assets that they talked about. Okay, these were the loans sold to the poor, sold to racial minorities because they couldn't. And they say, hey, you can get a house. They said, we can. Yeah, we got a loan for you, and it's only cost you $1,000 a month. But don't look at that fine print because in a year or two you won't be able to afford to live in this house. And beyond that, they were phoning up the documents. I can tell you all kinds of stories, don't have time, but they phonied up the loan documents about income. Yeah, it doesn't matter. They called them liar's loans in the industry. Anyone with no income. Strippers were getting 5 houses. They showed this in Big Short, but that's partly true. That came out in the information. So they, as I just said, they securitized these loans. They bundled them up. They were supposed to be rated very high, but there was another issue there with the rating agencies, and that was nonsense. And then what blew up the system was people, and you have to, this is amazing how they get away with this under current or past laws. You were allowed to take out insurance on those. And so they would sell what were called credit default swaps, which were, if you thought the security was going to die, and this is from Big Short, from Inside Job, you could buy insurance. So it'd be like me, without owning the property, being able to say, you know, you have a house, and I'll bet that your house is going to burn down. So I'll buy that insurance. Now, that's incredible conflict of interest. I have a vested interest in your house burning down, right? Can you do that in real life? Can you take out insurance on my house? No. They did this over and over and over again. And so when finally the bubble blew up and prices went down, they had to pay all the insurance. And guess what? Banks didn't have the money to do that. There's your debacle right there. They let it go to that point. So you had perverse incentives in the market. And perverse incentives, I mean, I testified in this case with Goldman Sachs, one of the big boys. This was kind of cute, about disclosure. And this is legal stuff. I was there with John Coffey from Columbia and all these folks and Harvard attorneys. And I'm telling them about criminogenic environments, which actually made it into the national report, which is cool because we got a little sociology, criminology into the conversation here. These guys were essentially selling people junk, say, you know, knowing that these securities were going to fail, and then secretly, after they didn't tell the client, by the way, the stuff in here is toxic, they go, no, this is, and they just figure you're a sophisticated buyer, you would know. They're under no obligation. These hearings are about should they go to jail and should there be legal obligations to tell clients about this. They would sell the security to the person, then on the side, and they would get all kinds of, they knew what was going on. They picked the people to pick up junk and put them into those loans. On the side, they would take out insurance. So they knew that it was going to fail. When it failed, the client lost their money, and they gained. And this is exactly what Goldman Sachs just paid a $10 billion fine over, of which they can write off, about $4.5 million or so. They only have to pay $5 million. To them, I don't know what, you know, on a scale of what they make, that's like a month's profits or something. It's absurd. It's not even a slap on the wrist, it's a touch on the wrist. It's a touch on the wrist. So you had the real estate bubble, as I mentioned, and what's tied to this that people don't, they understand it, but they don't get it in terms of the type of fraud we're talking about here, is outrageous executive compensation. While these erroneous profits are being booked, while they're doing their magic and getting away, they're selling, just as we saw with Enron, just as we saw with SNL, same thing with the current crisis. They are getting away with murder. Now, just to give you an idea, in the US, executives, top executives, make something like 450 times the amount of a line worker in their company, on average. Top executives. When you add up the millions of the 50, you know, hey, what's that guy make? 50,000, 100,000? Good, yeah, they get a good job. What'd you make? 250 million with bonuses. Now, in other countries, that's unheard of. So in a comparative sense, if we look at Japan, which used to be the second biggest economy, we're going to be the second biggest economy soon with China, if not already. Japan third. If you look at Japan, it's like 80, 90, we're 450. And if you go to Japan, the CEOs actually eat in the same lunchrooms with the workers. They don't have shared office space with the workers. They're not in some executive suite somewhere hidden away. They're out there with the workers. It's a group thing. So the outrageous compensation I'll get back to, but that's really how they got away. If you're wondering how they got away with it, they compensated themselves while all this was going on, sold all their stuff, and by the time everyone woke up, and I put that in quotes, because they knew what was going on, they were gone. And we paid for $800 million bailout. Most of that money has actually come back to the banks, but we, all of a sudden, the biggest capitalists in the world who were running the US became socialists overnight and said, oh, we got to bail out, we got to have a government bailout of all these private companies. That was pretty hysterical. And then what happened? The people said no. They did it, so they couldn't do it because everybody wrote to their congresspersons. A couple of days later, under emergency conditions, Hank Paulson, head of the Treasury, former Morgan Stanley guy, comes in, does a backroom deal. They do it back and they pass it, even though the people said no, and the initial vote was no. So they passed it, got their bailout, saved the bank. They said, and you know, the bottom line there is kind of, the issue is, how do we save the economy? Well, there were laws on the books from the savings and loan crisis which said, you got a crooked institution that's financially insured by the government and has anything to do with government money, and these banks clearly do, it's government insured money. You can go in, take over the bank, and throw out all the management. And the people who have savings in the bank don't know the difference. They call it a different bank the next day. This probably happened to you, it's happened to me, where I go, I had a mortgage with so-and-so, now you have a mortgage with this. Same thing, doesn't matter to you, the government guarantees it. That's fine. They didn't do that. They let the same idiots stay there. They bailed out the banks, and their rationale was, well, they're the experts, they would know how to run this, you know, and so we got to keep them there. This is what they said at hearings. You know, why is this person at AIG, how could, oh, well, no one else knows what that person knows, and so to save, you know, whatever. So coming back to sociology, you have severe enforcement capacity issues over the past decade, and we'll talk about this. Enforcement agencies are generally understaffed. There's lots of evidence and writing about this. And here's just a piece of it. 36% staff reduction in FBI agents dealing with white-collar crime from 2001 to 2008. What happened in 2001?
Bush came in 9/11.
9/11, yeah. Well, Bush came in 9/11. Yeah, what happened? 9/11? They didn't hire a whole bunch of new white-collar crime staff. They took all the white-collar crime folks and said, oh, by the way, you got to go do terrorism now. Okay. That was the beginning.
What about since 2008?
2008, not much. But this is leading up to the debacle. That's why I'm giving you these numbers. Not much. Yeah, the hiring, but they didn't replace all those people. I was there in the 1980s. This is no joke. I was studying medical fraud. I went to the FBI in Washington. In the they didn't even call it white-collar crime, corporate crime, economic crime. 2 people. 2 people. Oh, because they were going after the real criminals, the common criminals. Into the 1980s. They didn't see this coming. Healthcare fraud became like a huge thing after that. They hired a lot of attorneys to do, attorneys and others, and healthcare professionals as well as enforcement people to do just healthcare fraud. But they had 2 people in the 1980s in Washington office. I met one of them. Cases dropped by over 25%. So if you're a statistician or somebody looking at numbers, you go, oh look, white-collar crime's going down. Nah. It's proactively policed. There are no victims that report white-collar crime, and you have to have enforcement staff there to discover it, period. So prosecutions dropped by more than 50%. There's the false issue of just looking at a number without knowing what's behind the number. So turning a blind eye to fraud. Why do we do this? How do we do this? Great piece written by Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, who's now at CUNY. Left Princeton last year. He's also a professor at CUNY now. Still writes in the New York Times. He's kind of the anti-conservative, if you will. And he wrote a great piece called How Did Economists Get It So Wrong? He had to write something. And basically, the bottom line of that article, you could read it, it's a page or so, it's pretty interesting. He said, economists were blinded by these mathematical models that had just bad assumptions. And so they said, no, it's a rational choice, it's this and that. And they did all their models, and they were wrong. Now, not every economist, but every economist that was advising policy was wrong. And this is a question, okay, and this is a question. People always ask, well, you know, if the economist is about, how come this stuff happens when they have, well, why don't they hire the right people, et cetera, et cetera? Well, bottom line is this. This is Bill Black's situation. He's probably the most brilliant person who knows everything about this because he was a regulator, a lawyer, an economist, and now a white-collar criminologist. He can't get a job in Washington. Why? Well, because he'd serve us too well. And he answered this in film when Michael Moore said, well, how did this guy get to this job when he was such an utter failure and so wrong about this? He says, You don't have to have the right answers. You just have to have the answers they want to hear. That's the magic. You don't have to be right. You have to give them the answer they want to hear, and they will move you up. This is why we end up in these situations. But anyway, interesting article, mathematical modeling, totally bizarre. Enforcement agencies got it wrong as well, too. The FBI did call this as early as 2004. No one listened to them. So they were right about it. They said there's going to be, their words, an epidemic of mortgage fraud. They said this in 2004. Publicly, it's in the papers, the data's there, etc. But they got it wrong because they looked at the borrowers. They were blaming the victims. They didn't blame the banks. They never thought that, oh, well, the banks wouldn't do this, then why would they kill themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So only minor offenses thus far have been prosecuted. Again, the mice versus the lions roaming free. Now, to get to this from a sociological, criminological point, Barry Getz, really brilliant piece. I remember reviewing this piece for Law and Society Review, very important journal, blah, blah. Most of the stuff you get, you go, it's okay, revise, resubmit, no good, blah, blah. This one I read, I said, this is incredible, this is a great article. White-collar crime is a non-issue. Sorry about the missing quotation. He says, class bias and non-enforcement, which is due to these capacity issues, creates a structural cloak that hides serious white-collar law breaking. So again, if you want to look at white-collar crime and say, well, like it goes up, it goes down, it's like you're looking at the tip of the iceberg. All icebergs are much bigger underneath. Whatever capacity you have, that's what you see. And the structural cloak, it's not just politics, it's non-enforcement and class bias. Look to the poor people, look to the powerless people, look to the less rich people, whatever we want to cut it, those are the people that enforcement is gearing towards, not to the higher ones. Why? Well, it's much more work. They can't produce numbers. They can't figure it out. They can't do this. They can't do that. So he hits class bias, non-enforcement. So understanding white-collar crime is really the central issue here. What pisses me off, excuse my French, as a white-collar criminologist, is when I go to conferences, I go to presentations, I hear, crime is this, crime is that. You hear this, and you go, crime. What are they talking about? They're talking about crime? They talk about crime, but they really should be saying common crime, not crime. And if you, and at the ASC meetings, American Society of Criminology, there's 7, 10, 15 panels out of 1,000 on white-collar issues. We all look at it the same way. You said these people are talking about crime. They're not talking about white-collar crime. You know, you're looking at the history of punishment in the US. It's about crime? No, it's about common crime. If they identified it scientifically correctly as common crime, we could move forward. They don't. They keep us in the same narrative of, we're talking about crime this, crime does that, crime. Sorry, folks. You have no data on the other crime, and which, by the way, is 40 to 50 times more financially consequential than common crime, by every estimate, by experts, and 11 to 15 times the size in terms of personal violence. So we're talking about something which miniaturizes, in a way, common crime. So Barry Getz, Law and Society Review, discusses white-collar crime as a non-issue, class bias, non-enforcement, not merely politics, which needs to be theoretically create this structural cloak that hides it. That's it. There you go. There's sociology and criminology for you, really good criminology and sociology. Niels Schover and Francis Cohen, two very famous sociologists and criminologists, wrote about this a few years ago, studying and teaching white-collar crime, the populist and patrician perspectives. I've written about this, don't have time to get into it in full, but just briefly. But the patrician view, which some criminologists and sociologists have, typically from more elite backgrounds and or universities, say it's a legal issue. I've had this argument with NYU law professors about, prove to me that they stole the money. Prove it. Everything's about legal proof. It's like, what law did they break? And that's not the point. I mean, it is the point if you're a patrician, which says, and they minimize the impact of white-collar crime because they say, look, show me all these statistics. They aren't there. Considers only those cases found in official statistics. The populist view, which I believe Schover, I probably speak for Cohen and a whole bunch of other sociologists and criminologists believe in. This populist view presents a broader structural model. That is, it highlights power, respectability, and privilege in terms of the relationship of law and why these people are not found out. So it's not a question of let's look in the books and see the statistics and, oh, gee, see, we proved that white collar crime is a middle class to lower class offense altogether, because there's no people of high respectability in the statistics. That's nonsense. This argument goes back 60, 70 years. Sutherland made this argument, did a pretty good job that people still haven't learned it. The role of control fraud, this is what we haven't heard about so much. Control fraud is Black's term from his dissertation for crimes committed by those who run large firms that are designed to enrich themselves while victimizing their own institutions. It sounds perverse, and it is. Why would you take your own institution down? Well, if you could make $150 million and walk away from a carcass, what would, that's rational economic, thought. What do they care? They take the money and run. It's not, they don't care that there's going to be a long-term survival of their own institution. This is something that enforcement agents have yet to get their heads wrapped around, and it's current to this day, and there are U.S. attorneys who don't understand this. Legal, they'll say, well, it's legal, how? And then the question to us as people involved in justice, involved in sociology and criminology, regardless of whether, you do law, is does it or should it matter that that's the case, that it's legal? Cares? Oh, well, then you get the arguments. Then you get the arguments. So the fraud minimalist position taken by traditional, and this is a whole other story which I can't get into, but the fraud minimalist position taken by traditional law and economics scholars and legal approaches is flawed and is at odds with the sociological and criminological research, which shows that control fraud actually takes place. That yes, these people do commit these crimes at the top and get away with them. Control fraud. Kitty Calavita and I called it collective embezzlement. Black called it control fraud, same kind of deal. So it does not account for the role of control fraud in financial debacles. These folks don't even talk about it. In fact, if you look at the Bible of the law and economics approach, which is Fischel and Easterbrook's the economic structure of corporate law, which I've looked at a number of times, and which is taught at most law and economics classes in the United States today, University of Chicago, they say that a rule against fraud, and this is almost verbatim, I'm not making this up, is not even necessary because markets will ferret out fraud and take care of it naturally. So we don't have to worry about it. This is, I'm not making it up. You'll find, I think it's page 65. It's in one of my pieces. I quote it. A rule against fraud is not necessary. In other words, you don't need laws about regulation and fraud. It's free market stuff. So, U.S. savings and loan crisis. I mentioned that earlier. The U.S. corporate and accounting meltdowns of 2002 involving those companies and that accounting firm. That's the whole thing we can talk about. We have 20 minutes. I'll get done in a second. Control fraud, which we just talked about, hyperinflates financial bubbles. You can look at control fraud not as causing the debacle, but as actually like gasoline being thrown on a fire, which makes it crazy and bigger. That's what it is. It's the weapon of choice is accounting. Economist Hyman Minsky, he used to call this the Ponzi phase of bubbles. And it was like literal, but it was also figurative. It is the Ponzi phase. It's figurative and literal. It makes them much bigger. And that's due to lack of regulation and enforcement present in these crime facilitative environments, which I don't have time to explain, but you can kind of get what that means. And my big accomplishment in the last 50 years or 20 years was getting that term in print in the National Commission report, that criminogenic environments were in place, because that's a sociological and criminological term. Needleman and Needleman, 1960s, 70 something. Anyway, I don't have much time, so let me just go through this quickly. This is crime control versus damage control. This is an interesting idea. Kitty Calavita and I looked at this in a piece we did 20 years ago. And this is, we were looking at the savings and loan. Long story, but short is, prosecutions took place, over 1,000 major prosecutions, people went to prison, because there was an unprecedented white-collar crime wave in the industry close to the heart of the economy. Close to the heart of the economy. It wasn't the heart. The heart is the financial system. These were savings and loans, not the big banks. The current case, there are no major prosecutions in the industry constituting the very heart of the economy. And that is a real interesting idea and relates to legitimacy, state theory, all kinds of interesting things in sociology and criminology, which we don't have time to get into, but that's what it relates to. So why no major crimes found or prosecuted this time? Government refused to act on early warning signs from the FBI, as I mentioned earlier, for 2004, regarding this epidemic. And those in power were close to, recruited from, beholden to those whose acts were questionable, resulting in lack of political will to prosecute. Yeah, but you unpack that, it's basically more inequality. The government was pushed to act quickly to bail out failed institutions. Prosecuting them later would be highly problematic as well as downright embarrassing. Don't have time to talk about that, Will, if you're interested, but I have some stories about that too. So what was done to us was not just bad luck, an economic cycle, it happens, whatever. Crisis wasn't simply inevitable, it was done to us. The virtual absence of criminal referrals by regulators is much unlike the savings loan debacle. Much unlike, maybe that's the understatement of the year. I won't ask you if you know how many criminal referrals there were in the savings loan debacle, but the regulators made tens of thousands of them. That's the most serious kind of referral. In the current crisis, zero. Thank you for the last 10 or 20 years of enforcement work in regulatory agencies. You want to talk about gutted enforcement of white-collar crime? There it is. Tens of thousands in the 1980s against savings loans. Zero in the current crisis, not one. Bush appointed people who didn't believe in regulation. Despite early warnings, the government adopted this hands-off approach. There was no enforcement capacity to investigate major frauds. Relying on banks to report on themselves assumes that they cannot be involved in the defense of themselves. In other words, yeah, there is no such thing as control fraud. All right, so this is basically reiterates that. Crimes by the organization against the organization. That was a term Kitty and I used a lot, and a lot of people picked up on it. Yes, it is you are doing things that are bad for your organization that will essentially lead to its demise. You don't have this reputation issue, all these things they talk about in corporate governance. All right, so anyway, some of the books. Myself, Tillman, here we had Will, the Handelman Brotherton wrote about this in a book. So we have a bunch of books and books coming out that are talking about this. So the conclusions, we need to unpack through research the concepts of status and power when examining white-collar and corporate offenses. And it has to do with just some of the things. Legal resources, what are those? The downward focus of authorities, the power of large financial institutions, social justice issues, separate justice for the rich and poor. We've created a criminal justice system which essentially has separate, because we have no major prosecutions for the biggest criminals, but lots of prosecutions for those below. Lack of elite prosecution, I don't have time to get into that, lack of another piece. Chronic system capacity problems with key enforcement agencies, and finally, the lack of prosecution of senior high-level executives in the 2008 scandal illustrates the dynamics of keeping white-collar crime a non-issue. Gets his term, it's a non-issue. How does it? Well, read the piece. It's class bias and capacity. Sutherland in 1949 noted that the less critical stance of government towards business persons was due to this cultural homogeneity and social proximity. The 2008 debacle illustrates, at least at perhaps one of the most basic levels, the lack of justice both domestically and globally. That is, legal protection is directly proportionate to the power and status of the perpetrator, as well as to the absolute amount of damage and loss to society, which, by the way, was trillions of dollars worldwide. You want to talk about suffering? You want to talk about inequality? There's nothing that comes close to this. This is the big one. And coming back from it is hard enough. Stated slightly differently, the greater the status of the perpetrator and the absolute amount of financial loss and damage to society, the less the chance of criminal prosecution and overall justice in society. And finally, this is just a little cartoon. You lock the barn door after the horse escaped. The horses are escaping. That's Wall Street and the rest and banks. Absolutely untrue. I still haven't locked it. There's the guy with the key, the U.S., Wall Street regulation, the barn door's open, et cetera. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for going so fast. We have time for questions. Thank you. If you want to ask questions, we can just pass the mic around. We have 15, 20 minutes. We're in good shape. Thank you.
Professor Pontell.
Yeah.
There's a lot of economic research that dictates that there's going to be another financial crisis in the years to come, and asset prices now. How would you go about trying to persuade those in power to try and prevent it?
Well, good. There's always going to be crises. If we don't change, if we don't give them this, if we don't change this blueprint for it, the blueprint, I believe, my view is that, and those of some others believe that the blueprint involves the lack of understanding or even acceptance of alternate types of
models. So you have Lawrence Summers. Someone was just telling me in the class that they went to a conference over here, my colleagues. Lawrence Summers was there. I said, oh, brilliant guy. Absolutely wrong many times, but a brilliant guy. He's the guy that Bush picks, Obama picks. I'm going, it's just shocking. So these crises will occur as long as you have these people, if you will, with the wrong models in power in those positions. Because they're the ones influencing. And I go on and on about stories, Brooksley Born versus Greenspan. You know, she was right, she got nailed. Anybody who's right gets nailed. The people who give them the answers they want to hear, those people stay and everything is fine. So, yeah, part of the answer to that is until they understand control flow, which they don't, they're going to continue to have these asset bubbles and crises because they're making money. It's a good thing for them.
So, are we as consumers powerless?
I don't think we're powerless, but I think research has a lot to do with it. The more research gets out there, the more education that takes place, the more people that understand this, the better. And you could see this with Bernie Sanders. Could anyone ever imagine back, and you were kids then, but back in 2008, the Occupy movement happening? That was a worldwide movement. What were people saying? Look, and Bill Black and economists, and they were all out there. We were all sending them information so they could make speeches and all this stuff. Worldwide, this happens again, you may have a revolution on your hands. People will not stand for this, and we're out in the streets. And you know, I wrote a piece with Bill Black, which I'm happy to send you if you're interested, which concludes, instead of turning the fire hoses on the people who are demonstrating, who just lost their jobs, and calling them the deviants and criminals, perhaps just a little bit of regulation up front would have prevented all this from happening. It would have been much less expensive, much less punishment-oriented, all that. And you would be blaming the right people. I'm happy to send that to you. So, yeah, good question.
Just wanted to ask if you have any opinion.
I'm sorry, by the way. His name is Lou Contos,
Hi.
criminology coordinator,
Yes.
also known to me as Lou. Lou.
I have the sports name. You talked about politics as being used as an excuse, and but then you wanted to say more. Maybe now you can say a few more words. In particular, I'm curious about what your thoughts are about the Obama administration and how it is that the Obama analysis seemed to be much more precise than and
Precise
good.
in terms of what?
Well, in terms of the analysis of the situation, and then Summers and people come in like this, and you have a different kind of policy. Obama, for instance, admits to having said to the assemblage of Citibank folks and Jamie Dimon and all that he's the guy standing between them and the pitchforks, right? So it seemed like he had a sense of how far he could go one way, what the consequences would be of the other thing. You know what I mean? So, do you want to say? I'm curious. Like,
Well, I mean,
where do you
it's
see
leverage.
Obama in all this?
It's leverage. I mean,
Yeah.
what you're saying sounds like leveraging. It's political leveraging. But in terms of the idea that I was trying to express, again, it's a good question. Thank you.
The politics, to just say it's politics, denies unpacking that term. And so when someone says, oh, it's politics, until we change the politics. Well, Bernie Sanders probably has the best message of all the, I mean, if you're on that side of, yeah, I like him simply because he's highlighted this, and Bill Black is actually working for him. He's not going to get the nomination, but he is unpacking the term. So to say it's politics, well, it's politics as usual. It's status quo. It's the same thing. That has nothing to do with new research, new terms, new policy things. Inequality isn't in that exactly as a politics. Well, it's about inequality, and it's about capacity. And will we ever have the capacity under the current terms, especially when the 0.1%, because we know this through stratification studies, are in charge of 95% of our wealth? To me, to almost any economist who's not the most conservative ideologue, that is absolutely insane. So that's my short answer to a long question, but yeah, unpacking it is really the issue, unpacking politics.
Thank you for a very interesting and insightful presentation. Thank you for a very interesting and insightful conversation. My question is, what just we learn from people who hide their money abroad in Panama, for example? Do you see anything that goes into what you talked about in that context?
Yeah, I think that there's lots there's lots of, you know, the Panama Papers, which Andrew was nice enough to send me as soon as he saw it, is just one example. The offshore, the tax havens, the way that the rich essentially preserve their money. We all have stories. I mean, I have relatives who, you know, they think they're middle class, and I'm thinking, well, you're kind of middle class, but you're pretty rich, and they don't like to pay taxes. And I think, well, you know, you're in a place that enabled you to gain that kind of wealth. The least you can do is pay back the taxes. I tell my students, and this is my personal view, is I want to pay as much taxes as I can in my life. As simple as that. It's not answer. And there are other people who, it's greed, it's fear of falling, whatever issues they have, that they feel like, well, I made it, so why should I give anything back? Well, you made it here. And this state allowed you to make it. And so when you go to places like Canada, we were just discussing healthcare fraud. Even conservatives in Canada don't think like we do about healthcare, where it's like, why should I pay for the other person who can't? It's like, we don't think like that. It's like, what if the person can't afford it? I have to pay. These are conservatives saying this. Here, conservatives say, sorry, it's America, individual, tough luck. And we, like no other civilized society on the face of the earth, still do not have nationalized health care. That's really issue.
So listening to the talk, it makes me think about John Jay a little bit and the culture and the climate of.
Sorry.
No, not him. I mean, just the emphasis of criminal justice.
Yeah,
It seems very backwards because if I understand correctly, you know, the free market myth and the things that are driving inequality should be understood as a root cause, and then we are tackling the symptoms of that. And it seems so odd and almost moronic to only invest in time and funds and research and literature into the band-aids of things.
Exactly right.
And
You hit it on the nose.
yeah, so it's
These are symptoms.
yeah, it's very odd to have an entire climate and culture of an institution that fails to recognize what's driving common crime in the first place and cannot make a simple distinction in terms of white-collar crime and common crime.
Yeah.
So it's just so odd, and I imagine it has to do with power and status and maintaining.
That is an absolutely on the mark analysis of what I was trying to show. But let me go beyond what you're saying. Because we're at John Jay, it's not just John Jay. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. You go to Harvard, go to NYU, go to Columbia, go to any place. I have the same discussions with similar kinds of people who don't see these as the symptoms. Now, just to reiterate your point, the other night on 60 Minutes, anyone watch 60 Minutes? They had the Rikers Island thing. It's unbelievable. I'm watching that. I'm like furious. What they're doing is they're prosecuting the mice in Rikers Island. And this is what they're spending their time and money doing. It's unbelievable. It's beyond any capacity issue. They can't fix Rikers Island. They call it the biggest mental institution in the United States. It's a symptom. You would go back to Russian Kirkheimer, 1939, 49, Punishment and Social Structure. The principle of least eligibility, which says that the worst conditions in prisons, and this is written about, 70, 80 years ago, the worst conditions of prisons, right? Or let's see if I get this right. The worst have to be worse than the worst conditions in society. If we're all driving around in Rolls Royces and we all have total liberty and everything's fine, we have health care, we have all of our needs taken care of, and we get a penalty that looks like, they talk about the value of punishment, a penalty that looks like 5 days without, cookies or whatever, and driving around. We'll all freak out. But, yeah, okay, thank you. But if if the lowest part of society is living in utter chaos economically, guess what those institutions like Rikers have to look like according to the principle of least eligibility, which I personally believe is true, because I've seen it in jails around the country. I've seen it everywhere. That's why we have such horrible prison conditions here versus in Europe, where they have less inequality, and people on death row are able to live in apartments with keys to their cells. That was also on 60 Minutes. That's no joke. That's reality. But that's simply because of the principle of least eligibility. So yeah, I would relate this way beyond, yeah, it occurs here, but this is just a reflection of what society does in general, everywhere. White collar crime is not a big course.
We produce students
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
just uphold and maintain the
Yeah.
entire
Right.
system, and it's flawed reasoning.
Right. But that's absolutely the point. What I'm saying about justice overall, and why I named this justice, is we're supposed to be about justice here, is that until we come to grips with this inequality and this stealing of the money that goes to the top 0.1%, all these other things are symptoms. You're not going to fix the jail system by prosecuting the jailer and saying, oh, I found out they hid information about the death of a man. That's not going to fix it.
It's a small issue. It's a very serious issue. It's a small issue.
The way the issue is often formulated is too big to fail and too big to jail. But the message I get from your talk is that jail is really not the answer. Punishing top executives wouldn't correct the situation. It might appease the anger of the public.
Right.
But we need regulation, reparations,
Absolutely.
reorganization.
Oh, we have to, okay, I agree. Absolutely, good point.
And I'm with Gil Geis on this, who is my mentor, a white-collar criminologist. True, you can't put them in jail. You'll never have the capacity. It'd be ridiculous. You need to restructure. You need to have absolute regulation. But at the same time, and I actually said this in front of Congress, I said, do white-collar criminals fear going to prison? And should that be a first step for anyone who, if they don't do the compliance, if they don't, you gotta put their ass in jail at some point. And if you don't, the message to them is cost of business. I will not have to fear a thing. And as long as they have that attitude, that what we call an illusion of invulnerability, guess what? They will do control fraud. And at some point, some of them, well, that's not the answer. You're absolutely right. But it's a two-pronged approach. Quick answer to a very good question. Two-pronged, I agree with you. Yes. Francis.
Yeah, I was gonna say something along the lines of what the speaker before me said, that, you know, as of right now, all we have is fines that are imposed on these corporations that are doing these horrendous things, and you know, certainly jail won't do it justice, because we can jail someone, but they also have other people who can take over and still run the corporation as they would from inside. So yeah, there would have to be regulations imposed, and maybe they would have to create something other than fines. You know, something more serious, something a little bit more.
They have to sometimes criminally prosecute. We need to have criminal prosecutions where compliance fails. There's all kinds of models to use with this in terms of getting corporations to comply. A lot of scholars look at compliance models. The deterrence part of it is this much, but in the compliance models, deterrence is there. That means certain severe exposure. That I agree. So I hope that is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We need not only to give them the opportunity to pay a fine, which they look at, but in every compliance system, the failure to comply over and over again, the enforcement ladder moves up to finally you're in prison. So yeah, it may be this much of it, but
Maybe
it's part of it.
like how they have the 3 strikes rule applied to the, you know, people
Yeah.
who are on the streets in California. Maybe they can have something like that for corporations, where
Absolutely.
they have the ability to shut a corporation down.
Absolutely. Well,
Or-
part of it is also penalizing shareholders, but if you didn't know what they were doing, and you own that stock and your investments, they hate to penalize the shareholder.
I mean, either way, they would still be out of it. You know, if they still took it, like Enron, they took everything and people lost all their benefits and pensions. So either way, they're gonna lose it in the end, regardless.
Right.
So I guess at that point, it doesn't really matter how.
Right. There are different situations. I can give you different stories, but bottom line is you're generally correct. I agree with most everything.
One last question. Anyone?
Hello, I just wanted, I missed most of the presentation, but wouldn't you say that the Constitution is the root?
The Constitution is a root of this problem? Yeah. No. Short answer, not really. Yeah, you know, it's a good point. No, I've thought about this. This is a good point. We have a criminal justice system, you know, it's constitutionally based, et cetera, that is an adversary system. The protections go to the individual. Why? Because as individuals, we're against this big state, so we supposedly get protections, except if someone picks you up and you're the wrong person and you're not convicted and you get to Rikers Island and die. Law in the books versus law in action. You have certain rights, and we have a lot of rights in this country, on paper. You know, so if you're brought before criminals, you get a right to this, you get a right to that. Yeah, all the protections. For white-collar criminals, in particular, I always think that maybe we should redo the Constitution and/or some laws that don't give them those same protections, because when they have those same protections, they're not powerless. Sometimes they have more money and more resources at their control than the government. So what was there to protect us from the government is now protecting the white-collar criminals from the government. So, yeah, good point. Hope that answers it. Anyway, are we done? Are we finished? Thank you so much for coming.